February 1943. Central Tunisia. The wind moves slowly through the mountain passes, carrying dust, smoke, and the sharp smell of burned fuel. Wrecked American tanks sit abandoned along narrow roads, their steel hulls blackened and silent. Helmets lie where men dropped them. Ammunition boxes are scattered unopened. The fighting has passed, but what remains is not victory. It is shock. The American army had arrived in North Africa with confidence, fresh from training grounds and factories. But at Kasserine Pass, confidence turned to chaos. Inexperienced soldiers faced veteran German forces. Orders contradicted one another, radios went silent, and tanks were abandoned on narrow mountain roads. Men retreated without cohesion, equipment was lost, and morale crumbled. Reports arrived at headquarters with casualty figures and shattered units, each one a reminder that the army was untested in real war. Into this disaster came General George S. Patton, Jr., a man known for strict discipline and uncompromising standards. He took command of II Corps with one clear mission: to restore order, enforce accountability, and rebuild an army that had just been humiliated. In the 10 days that followed, officers were relieved, units reorganized, and soldiers were forced to confront failure. Kasserine Pass had nearly broken America's army, but Patton's decisive actions would save it, proving that leadership under fire can change the course of history. By late 1942, the Second World War had entered its fourth year. Across Europe, Axis forces still held vast territory. The Soviet Union was locked in a war of annihilation on the Eastern Front. Britain, exhausted but unbroken, had spent years fighting alone on land, sea, and in the air. The United States, despite its industrial power, remained a newcomer to large-scale ground combat. America's entry into the war after Pearl Harbor had been sudden and absolute, yet building an army capable of fighting modern, mechanized warfare could not be done overnight. Divisions expanded rapidly. Officers were promoted quickly. Doctrine evolved faster on paper than in practice. Training fields in the United States could simulate movement and fire, but not the pressure of a determined enemy. North Africa became the testing ground. Operation Torch, launched in November 1942, was the first major Allied amphibious landing of the war. American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria, aiming to trap Axis troops in Tunisia between two advancing armies. On paper, the plan promised a swift campaign. In reality, it placed inexperienced U.S. units directly in contact with veteran German formations. The German Afrika Korps, shaped by years of desert warfare, understood maneuver, combined arms, and deception. Their commanders expected confusion from new opponents and prepared to exploit it. While British units had already learned these lessons at heavy cost, many American commanders were encountering them for the first time. U.S. II Corps, the principal American ground force in Tunisia, held long, thin defensive lines across difficult terrain. Command relationships were unclear. Authority was often fragmented between corps, division, and allied command structures. Orders moved slowly. Intelligence moved slower. In Washington, optimism remained high. American industry was surging. Manpower was vast. Defeat, it was assumed, would be temporary. But in Tunisia, assumptions were about to meet reality. As Axis forces regrouped in early 1943, they identified a weakness, one that ran not just through mountain passes, but through the structure of the American command itself. That weakness led directly to Kasserine. The Kasserine Pass was never meant to be decisive. It was a narrow corridor through the Atlas Mountains, a place of movement rather than defense, held by scattered American units tasked with watching wide ground using limited forces. The terrain favored whoever acted faster, coordinated better, and understood how to concentrate power at the right moment. In February 1943, Axis commanders saw an opportunity. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, facing increasing pressure from British forces in the east, sought to strike westward before Allied strength fully matured. His aim was not total destruction, but disruption. An WWII meant to unbalance the Allies, seize supplies, and test American resolve. What he encountered exceeded expectations. American defenses were fragmented. Units answered to multiple headquarters. Artillery support was often delayed by confusion over authority. Armor was used defensively, dispersed in penny packets rather than concentrated for counterattack. Communications failed under pressure. When German panzers advanced with infantry and air support, responses came piecemeal. Leadership failures compounded tactical ones. Some commanders hesitated to commit reserves. Others issued contradictory orders, ordering withdrawals while neighboring units were told to hold. Reports sent upward softened the reality of collapse, delaying decisive intervention. The result was a retreat that spread faster than control. Between February 14 and 22, Axis forces pushed through American positions, overrunning units and capturing equipment. U.S. casualties mounted. More damaging than losses was the psychological effect. Confidence eroded. Rumors spread faster than orders. For soldiers who had trained in confidence, the suddenness of defeat was disorienting. Allied headquarters could not ignore the pattern. British observers, experienced and blunt, recognized familiar mistakes. They had seen this before, earlier in 1940 in the Western Desert. This was not a failure of courage, it was a failure of command. By the time the Axis offensive slowed, the verdict was unavoidable. If the American army was to survive in North Africa, it needed immediate, uncompromising change. The solution would not come from gradual reform. It would come from a single, deliberate act of leadership. A new commander was already on his way. And with him came a different standard, one that would be enforced without hesitation. For the American soldier on the ground, Kasserine was not a lesson, it was a shock. Units that had trained for months found themselves retreating in days. Men who believed in their equipment and numbers now questioned both. Letters home changed in tone. Confidence gave way to uncertainty. The enemy was no longer abstract. It was disciplined, fast, and unforgiving. Many soldiers did not blame themselves. They sensed the confusion above them. Orders arrived late or not at all. Positions were abandoned without explanation. The battlefield felt leaderless. Trust, once shaken, does not break loudly. It erodes quietly. American command culture before Kasserine valued caution and procedure. Promotions had come quickly in peacetime expansion. Some officers had never commanded under fire. Decision-making often flowed upward rather than forward. Initiative, though encouraged in doctrine, was restrained in practice. When pressure mounted, this system faltered. Leaders waited for permission while the enemy advanced. Responsibility blurred. Failure became collective, difficult to isolate, harder to correct. German commanders did not underestimate American courage. They underestimated American cohesion. To them, the battlefield revealed hesitation, dispersed armor, and predictable responses. After-action reports noted a lack of coordinated counterattack. Once momentum shifted, they pressed relentlessly. To seasoned forces, this was not surprising. It was exploitable. Within Allied headquarters, these perspectives converged. Different angles pointed to the same conclusion. Defeat at Kasserine was not inevitable. It was enabled. And correcting it would require more than encouragement. It would require disruption, personal, visible, and immediate. That disruption arrived with a commander whose reputation preceded him. At Kasserine, American units fought the war they had trained for, not the war they were in. Tanks were spread out to support infantry instead of massed for decisive action. Artillery, the most effective American advantage, was underused due to rigid command channels. Air support, though available, lacked coordination with ground units. German forces fought differently. They combined armor, infantry, artillery, and air power into a single, synchronized blow. Movement was fast. Decisions were made forward. When resistance appeared, it was overwhelmed rather than negotiated. The contrast was not technological, it was doctrinal. To Allied observers, what failed at Kasserine was also image. Soldiers appeared unshaven. Equipment was disorganized. Checkpoints were lax. These details mattered. They reflected a deeper absence of enforced standards. In modern war, discipline shapes behavior long before the first shot is fired. A change in leadership would need to be visible, felt immediately, even before orders were issued. Replacing officers in wartime carries consequences. Careers end. Reputations collapse. Yet allowing failure to persist costs lives. The moral burden of command lies not in loyalty to individuals, but responsibility to those who follow. Kasserine forced that reckoning. When General George S. Patton Jr. arrived to take command of II Corps, he did not come with patience. He came with intent. He understood that armies do not change gradually under fire. They change when standards are enforced, and when leaders know failure has consequences. His first decisions would make that clear. And they would come quickly. George S. Patton Jr. assumed command of U.S. II Corps on March 6, 1943. The timing was deliberate. The Allies could not afford another collapse. The next engagement would not wait for morale to recover on its own. Patton arrived with no speeches and no apologies. He arrived with inspections. Within hours, he was moving through forward areas unannounced. He examined weapons. He questioned officers on their plans. He noted details others ignored: dirty uniforms, unsecured positions, vehicles parked without dispersion. To Patton, these were not minor infractions. They were symptoms of decay. His orders followed immediately. Officers who hesitated, who failed to maintain control, who could not articulate their mission, were relieved. Some were reassigned. Others were removed entirely. The process was swift and unmistakable. Commanders learned quickly that explanations would not replace results. Patton did not disguise his intent. He believed that uncertainty in leadership was more dangerous than enemy fire. By removing those he judged unfit, he aimed to create clarity: one voice, one standard, one chain of command. These firings sent shockwaves through II Corps. Fear spread faster than encouragement, but fear, Patton believed, sharpened focus. It forced officers to think forward, not upward. At the same time, he reorganized command relationships. Lines of authority were simplified. Artillery was centralized. Armor was ordered to fight as mass, not fragments. Defensive positions were tightened. Movement was regulated. Nothing was left ambiguous. The army felt different within days. But Patton understood that discipline alone could not erase defeat. The true test would come not in inspections, but in battle. And battle was approaching. Over the next 10 days, Patton's reforms moved from paper to practice. Forward units conducted coordinated drills. Artillery rehearsals synchronized fire with infantry movement. Tank companies learned to operate in concentrated formations, exploiting terrain instead of reacting randomly. Radios that once delivered contradictory orders now linked command and front lines. Every adjustment was purposeful, every standard enforced. Morale began to shift, not instantly but perceptibly. Soldiers noticed officers taking responsibility, issuing clear commands, and moving decisively. Rumors of firings faded into stories of renewed competence. Fear transformed into focus. Confidence, once fractured, began to return. On March 17, II Corps faced its first coordinated engagement under Patton's command. At Sidi Bou Zid and later at El Getter, American forces held positions against German armored thrusts with determination previously absent. Artillery barrages fell accurately. Armor counterattacks were decisive. Where confusion had once ruled, initiative and coordination prevailed. The enemy noticed too. Rommel, in reports to Berlin, acknowledged American forces were becoming harder to exploit. German attacks met resistance that was methodical rather than chaotic. The days of effortless penetration through weak lines were ending. By March 22, II Corps was no longer merely surviving. It was performing. The 10-day transformation had restored not only operational effectiveness, but also the psychological backbone of the army. Officers who remained understood that accountability was real. Soldiers knew that leadership now acted decisively. Patton's decisive actions did not erase Kasserine, nor did they eliminate all risk. The campaign in Tunisia would continue to challenge the Allies for months, but the humiliation of February, the shock, the retreat, the chaos, had been confronted. Leadership had changed the trajectory. This transformation paved the way for victory in Tunisia and set the stage for the American army to fight with credibility on future fronts. The immediate consequences of Kasserine Pass were stark. U.S. II Corps had suffered over 6,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing. Dozens of tanks and hundreds of vehicles were destroyed or captured. Ammunition and supplies had fallen into Axis hands. The retreat through the Atlas Mountains was chaotic, leaving soldiers demoralized and commanders questioned. Newspapers and radio in the United States reported the disaster with growing concern, prompting scrutiny from Washington and London alike. Yet, within weeks of Patton's arrival, the narrative began to shift. Officers removed from command had left space for decisive leadership. Units were reorganized into coherent battle groups, artillery was centralized, and communications improved. Training focused not on drills in isolation but on battlefield realities. Soldiers who had hesitated now understood their roles in a chain of command that demanded clarity and accountability. Allied intelligence reports noted changes in American performance. British observers, initially skeptical of U.S. capabilities, began to record measurable improvements. When U.S. forces moved to counterattack Axis advances in Tunisia, they did so with a precision previously unseen. Where Kasserine had exposed vulnerability, Patton's reforms began to restore operational credibility. The morale of the rank-and-file soldiers improved rapidly. Letters home reflected growing confidence. Veterans who had questioned American leadership now described officers acting decisively, anticipating the enemy, and demanding coordinated effort. Fear had transformed into resolve. At the strategic level, Kasserine underscored the need for U.S. forces to learn quickly. American generals and planners recognized that battlefield competence was inseparable from leadership. They began implementing stricter officer evaluations, more realistic training exercises, and clearer command structures throughout North Africa. The broader consequences of Kasserine Pass extended beyond immediate battlefield recovery. In Tunisia, the campaign unfolded over the following months with heightened intensity. American units, now disciplined and reorganized under Patton's guidance, began to hold ground and launch coordinated attacks alongside British forces. The lessons of Kasserine informed every maneuver. Armor was concentrated, artillery integrated with infantry movements, and communication channels remained taut. When II Corps engaged Axis forces at places like El Getter and later during the final push toward Tunis, the difference was unmistakable. Where confusion had once dominated, clarity and cohesion prevailed. At the institutional level, Kasserine catalyzed structural reforms within the U.S. Army. Command evaluations became stricter. Junior officers were trained to think independently yet follow doctrine. Liaison with British and Free French forces improved. After-action reports, previously perfunctory, now included frank assessments of both success and failure. The U.S. military began to understand that victory in modern mechanized warfare required more than courage and numbers. It demanded leadership, accountability, and adaptability. Historical assessments underline the scale of the transformation. Military historians note that while American forces had suffered a tactical defeat, the rapid reforms instituted in the aftermath prevented a strategic collapse. The Army learned to leverage its numerical strength, industrial support, and now improved leadership to turn the tide in North Africa. General Omar Bradley later described Kasserine as a painful but necessary wake-up call that prepared U.S. forces for the rigor of the European campaigns to come. Patton's uncompromising enforcement of standards became a benchmark for leadership under fire, influencing doctrine well beyond Tunisia. Psychologically, the episode instilled a sense of realism and resilience among American forces. Soldiers understood that mistakes carried consequences, and officers knew that hesitation could cost lives. This clarity, though harsh, fostered an environment where preparation and decisiveness replaced uncertainty. The lessons extended into operational planning, tactical coordination, and morale management, shaping U.S. Army effectiveness for the remainder of the war. Kasserine Pass, once a symbol of failure, was thus reframed. Its significance lay not merely in defeat but in the urgent reforms it catalyzed, the leadership lessons it enforced, and the transformation it imposed on the American Army. From this crucible of adversity, a more disciplined, confident, and capable force emerged, ready for the campaigns that would follow. Kasserine Pass remains one of the most instructive episodes in American military history. On the surface, it was a defeat, soldiers retreating, equipment lost, confidence shaken. Yet beneath that failure lay a lesson that would shape not just a campaign, but the character of an army. Leadership, Patton demonstrated, could transform an organization in days if decisiveness, accountability, and discipline were enforced without compromise. The 10 days after Kasserine were not about punishment alone. They were about clarity, about aligning human will with the demands of modern warfare. Soldiers learned to trust their officers. Officers learned to trust their soldiers. Chains of command became living instruments rather than bureaucratic formalities. Every inspection, every order, every firing communicated a single truth. Survival depended on competence. In the wider context of history, Kasserine and its aftermath illustrate the cost of inexperience in war and the value of adaptive leadership. Modern armies study these days not for the battles themselves, but for the processes of transformation under pressure. The human element, morale, courage, fear, resolve, proved inseparable from technology, strategy, and doctrine. Victory, it seems, requires more than weapons. It requires men and women who can act decisively when the world collapses around them. Patton's actions at II Corps were neither flawless nor universally admired. Some saw them as harsh, others as necessary. Yet history judges by outcomes, and the U.S. Army emerged stronger, more effective, and more prepared. The shadow of Kasserine lingered, but it became a guiding light, reminding all who command that failure can teach, and that decisive leadership can save lives, armies, and even the course of a war. In the end, Kasserine Pass was more than a battle. It was a crucible of leadership. It was proof that an army, confronted with its own shortcomings, could rise, reform, and fight again. And it remains a testament to the enduring truth. In war, courage alone is never enough. Discipline, decisiveness, and accountability are what save nations.